Good morning. This is Tom Stackhouse. I am the Associate Director for the Technology Transfer Center at the National Cancer Institute, part of NIH, and I'm going to be your moderator for this next hour. Before we get started, though, I would just like to welcome you to FLC Virtual. I hope you've had a chance to take a look around in the virtual site to see the exhibit halls, the lounge, some of the pre-recorded sessions that were presented this morning. By the way, those pre-recorded sessions will be available to you both today and tomorrow. So if you didn't get a chance to see those and you want to go back and take a look at those, they'll be available for you. Our session this morning, we have Paul Zielinski, who is going to be talking to us about the Lab to Market program. Before I introduce Paul, I want to let you know that during the talk you have opportunity to ask questions of Paul. You see a chat box on your screen. You can enter your questions into that chat box. They will be monitored. We will try to answer those that are fairly short to answer during the session, and maybe some of the longer ones we'll save to the end when we'll have a question and answer period. So to get started, Paul Zielinski is Director of the Technology Partnership Office at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The Technology Partnership Office is responsible for NIST technology transfer activities, including patents, licenses, cooperative research, and its SBIR program. NIST also serves as the host agency for the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer, and Paul is currently the chair of the FLC. He has over 25 years of federal experience, and prior to joining NIST, Paul worked at the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy. In addition, Paul spent some time working in private industry, and he also served on active duty as a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Paul will be sharing with us today an overview and update on the Lab to Market program, a key element of the President's management agenda for accelerating the transfer of federally funded research from the laboratory to the commercial marketplace, and thereby increase the economic impact of federally funded research and development. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their day to join us here in this virtual session. This is kind of an experiment for us here at the FLC. This is the first time we've done such a virtual meeting, and it's sort of interesting to see how it will run and what our results will be, and so we're very interested in getting your feedback in all the sessions as well. So again, welcome. My name is Paul Zielinski, as already said. I'm the Director of the Technology Partnerships Office here at NIST and the current chair of the Federal Lab Consortium. And I want to talk to you about this whole Lab to Market effort. Now, if you're familiar with the FLC, you know this isn't exactly the newest thing. The FLC has been working on this idea of Lab to Market for quite some time. But in fact, it's really nice to have an emphasis from the higher parts of government, really looking down and taking an interest in what we do. You know, we had a very big election yesterday, and although there's some changes that are going to happen, I think this is one of those areas that we're lucky to have interest from both sides of the aisle. So I don't know that, even though there's been a shift in the Senate, I don't know that this is really going to affect some of our activities in Lab to Market. I know the administration is very committed to this activity, and as I said, we get interest from both sides. And so it's one of those things a rare commodity in Washington, everyone seems to agree on, that this is a real valuable tool and an economic boost. So like I said, it's not exactly a new activity. When you look back in 2011, October of 2011, the President issued a memorandum about accelerating technology transfer for commercializing new products. Now, this is a pretty comprehensive direction to agencies. It went out to all the agency heads and really made technology transfer part of their priorities. Now, I know in some agencies it's been more of a priority than others, but this really went across the board and actually drove specific responses from each agency talking about what steps they're going to take in order to increase the commercialization of their products, basically transferring their information from their bench scientists out to the marketplace. We developed a new set of metrics. We did quite a bit actually under the presidential memorandum, and it was actually quite a busy activity. There was a lot of work that's done, and we'll still see some of those activities rolling out for the next couple of years. But, that wasn't the end of the game, and I think that's the important thing, is that we created some plans under the presidential memorandum. We had a whole bunch of activity, but we didn't end there. So it sort of was recast into this Lab to Market effort. So all those activities were basically picked up in the President's management agenda. Now what the President's management agenda is, the President looked at what he's going to do for the rest of his term in office. What were the priorities? Now these things, of course, change day to day as things happen. But the President did lay out his major goals and intended accomplishments through the end of his administration. And that became the President's management agenda. Now, on top of that, the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA, as we like to call things in government speak and acronyms, but you actually have the GPRA Modernization Act, and that required the federal government to identify some primary areas that we want to work on, that work across all of the different agencies, and are areas that we can measure growth and progress basically to enhance the entire federal enterprise. So under this act, we had to identify then what are called cross-agency priority goals. So these are the main areas of emphasis across all government agencies that we want to focus on. So as you can picture, so again, if you follow sort of the flow here, we had a memorandum from the President directing everyone to really look at their technology transfer activities and accelerate this commercialization of our products, followed by putting it in the management agenda. Of course, this is required under the GPRA Modernization Act, and so it's no great big surprise that this, of course, became one of the cross-agency priority goals. And so if you do go to performance.gov, you will see the small set of cross-agency priority goals that the government will be focusing on. And if you go down underneath that and look underneath economic development, there's actually two goals. One of them is open data, and I think quite a few different, if you're in an agency right now, you're dealing with this open data initiative. And then the second is lab to market. And so we are a primary area for economic development on performance.gov for the federal government. So what does that mean? The goal statement is actually, this is flat out what it says in the lab to market. Again, no big surprise to any of us, that the economic impact of our federal research investment is important, and that it plays a key role in accelerating accelerating improvement, the transfer of these technologies into the marketplace. Basically, the marketplace has got an interest in what we're doing, and we can use our investment in R&D in order to leverage economic gain across the country. Again, this is the same thing we've been doing in the FLC, and we preach this quite a bit in the FLC, but it's nice to see this picked up in this sort of larger context of the cross-agency priority goal. Now, this is something we need to do now. Obviously, we've been going through a recession over the last several years, and if you look actually even at the history of our technology transfer legislation that we're dealing with, the Bayh-Dole Act, Stevenson-Wilder Act, back in 1980, we had the same type of a thing going on. We had an economic recession. In response to that, we turned to our laboratory investment and said, how can we get economic gain? We're doing the same thing now, but rather than passing new laws, because I think the laws we have right now are pretty good and very flexible. And so rather than changing that sort of background, we want to focus on this return on investment. How do we use the investment in research and development in order to become public gain? Private gain as well. We want to increase our economic output. So how are we going to do that? Well, one of the biggest things, of course, is streamlining. We hear it all the time. The government is very difficult to work with. We have a lot of red tape. How do we make it easier? How do we move at the speed of business is sort of one of those cliches you often hear. But it's very true, and I think everybody who's been working in technology transfer over the last several years has experienced this. One of the most common complaints we get from business is that we don't move fast enough. And how do you move faster? Well, sometimes you got to cut through some of the red tape and come up with new processes that will make things run faster in order to transfer these technologies out to business. We also need new tools. How can we better facilitate these partnerships? And then at the same time, of course, this is done under the GPRA Modernization Act, so it's not just a matter of doing it, but also taking a look at how do we evaluate and how do we judge what we've done. And by doing that, how do we understand what steps we need to take next? And that's also a key component then of this cross-agency priority goal, is actually improving the way we evaluate, not only just counting things, but actually the impact of our actions. Of course, part of this is also as I mentioned, there was actually two priority goals underneath economic development. And so we also have a little bit of a bleed over in how do we make these assets available? How do we better communicate what assets are available from the federal government? And how do we make sure that companies and businesses know how to reach us and how to partner with us? You know, the communication is one of those never-ending things, and that's one of the reasons we're happy to do this workshop, is we have to continually put that message out there that we are available, we have assets that are available for people to use, and we have ways to reach out and meet business on their terms. So all those things are all part of this vision and sort of the overall approach. So when I talk about sort of this overall R&D enterprise, $130 billion a year, more than $130 billion a year. Actually, you see the numbers between $130 and $140 billion if you look at any given year in research and development by the federal government. It's a big number. It's a lot of money that we're putting into it. It's a lot of the taxpayers' dollars that we're putting into this. And so we really owe it to the taxpayers to make sure we're doing the best we can to make sure they get a return on their investment in this research and development area. You know, it doesn't include just our laboratories as well. So it's the federal laboratories and the work that we do in our intramural programs within our laboratories, but also how do we get the most out of our investments that we give out in extramural research grants and federally funded research by universities and other partners. So it's really the entire picture of what do we get out of this massive investment that we do each year in research and development. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to change the focus of our research and development. We're still going to do fundamental research. It doesn't mean we're going to shift everything in our research program to suddenly doing applied research that can be transferred out, tomorrow. We still need to make sure that we do our governmental role of providing the fundamental research that's going to lead to future knowledge and expanding sort of the base of knowledge and science that we're using in all sorts of different areas. However, there is certainly an economic impact in that of developing the new knowledge. And as we all see in technology transfer, this often comes from places you don't expect. And so you do see things where, materials research in an energy technology laboratory can be used in a medical device. And those types of crossovers are actually some of the things that are more fun and interesting sometimes within this tech transfer field. But it's actually one of those things we also want to key on is making sure that we communicate. So it's not a matter of stovepiping and looking sort of for the familiar sources. They're important, don't get me wrong, but it's also trying to make sure people consider those maybe unfamiliar sources or maybe those areas that they didn't quite expect that they would get a result. As I said, we will continue to do basic research. I'm not in any way telling you that we're going to change what we're doing in research and development. Rather, we're going to change the way that we communicate information out to the public and make sure that they can receive this information from us. And so it involves more than simply looking at our sort of standard way of tech transfer, patent license and CRADA. We want to look at all the different ways that we can diffuse knowledge. How do we put this information out there for public use? Technology transfer is great if you can look, we do some great things. We have a lot of technologies that we will patent and we will license to people. We've done training sessions on that. We have our CRADA tools that we will use and we'll continue to streamline those processes. But part of it is looking at technology transfer in a much broader sense. How do we really communicate everything that we do? So if you take that $130 billion investment that we have in R&D, and then you try to roll that back to sort of like, well, okay, so how many royalties did you get last year? You're going to have a big divide there. So we don't want to look at tech transfer as just sort of this microscopic scale. We want to look at the big macro picture. Everything that we're doing in order to transfer our research and development out of our federal laboratories and out of our federal investments into public use. So we're going to make sure we're looking at everything. Leave no stone unturned, if you will, and make sure that we make this a priority within our system. So again, we're not going to change our focus on basic research. We will continue to do that as a federal government, but we are going to try to change our priorities. We're going to try to make sure that our laboratories can more easily focus on those things that are ready for commercialization, how we identify them and how we prioritize them with our senior management and with our scientists. It's one thing to have our tech transfer offices interested in this, but how do we include it sort of into the structure of our systems and into our laboratories and also into our greater investment in research and development? So, of course, part of this is developing a framework that works with business. We can't just have a rigid structure that says this is the way we all must do it. We know what happens every time we do that is we get a lot of pushback saying it doesn't work for me, one size doesn't fit all, and we want to make sure then that we tailor our activities to each agency to meet their unique mission needs because that's what drives our research. We also want to make sure that we're as I've mentioned several times, we want to make sure we're prioritizing this activity within that research and within that mission program. But again, it's going to be within the mission capabilities of that agency and of that laboratory to make sure that they're continuing to meet their basic mission that drives all of this research forward. So we're not going to change that fundamental basis of what we're doing. It will not, again, be one-size-fits-all in terms of agencies. There's going to be different levels of participation, and there's going to be different needs, and that's one of the nice things is that's recognized. And it's recognized even at the higher levels of our government to say that, we're not just going to tell you, here's how you have to do it, but rather we're going to ask people to participate and come up with new ideas and new initiatives as part of this process. So we want to see pilots. We want to see new ideas come to the table. We want to launch all sorts of different activities. So it's sort of one of the terms you always hear, and this is sort of the all of the above. We're not going to do just one thing. We want to do many things. We're going to come up with some seed ideas, and we will throw those things out there, and we will progress with them. But at the same time, we need participation. And when I say we, I really mean we, because it's not really limited to just me, and it's not limited to a small work group. But it's really out there for the whole community to come up with some ideas, and for different labs to try new things, and to try to bring them up into the communication and into the process. All of this is a key part of this activity, and this is why it's a cross-agency priority goal rather than just within a certain agency. We don't want it to be a stovepipe. We don't want it to be a one-size-fits-all. We want to try out new things, and we want to see what's going to work. We just had a recent GAO report that came out, and one of the things that it said is that the FLC as an organization needs to do more engagement with its stakeholders. And while I think we do a pretty good job reaching out to stakeholders, we can always do more. And I think that's one of those things we always have to recognize is, we know our message. And we know, and in a way you kind of start hearing yourself talk again and again and again, and you know what you're saying, and you've heard it so many times, and you kind of start thinking that other people have heard it. But I don't know that we've ever can say it enough, because frankly, businesses don't necessarily listen to that message until they need that information now. And so it's that continuing mission of making sure that we're engaging our stakeholders at the time that they need it and continually. Small businesses, as we all know, they don't have the resources. So how do we reach out to those small businesses and make sure that they have the tools that they need without ignoring the large companies who have a different set of needs? I'll tell you another thing you don't necessarily see here, but I had a large meeting yesterday with, for example, minority communities. So, historically black colleges and universities, minority-served institutions, they also have a very large role to play in this because it's very underutilized, and the capabilities of those institutions and the students that come out of there are a valuable resource. And we have to I use that as an example because we have to really reach out to all of these communities. It isn't a limited portion that, we can just hopefully serve the large businesses and hopefully we'll catch the small businesses we can. No, we want to make sure that we're catching everybody. And that's going to require quite a bit of input from all of the laboratories and a big effort from the FLC in order to make sure that we're communicating broadly and encouraging input. And I think that's really the heart of that GAO report when you get down to it, is how do we better improve our listening? How do we take in this information from others? And how do we consider it in our processes? So that's all an important part of this activity. And the FLC plays a major role in this activity. We have quite a few milestones that the FLC is the lead for in delivering across the federal government as well. So, what are the different things that we're going to do? So the action plan includes several key areas that affect everybody, really. Beginning with developing our human capital, so looking at the human element of this, our people, including researchers, tech transfer offices, customers, empowering effective collaborations. Obviously, one of our key things that we do are collaborations. So how do we make that easier for people? How do we streamline those operations? How do we come up with new tools and ways to conduct collaborations? In terms of assets, we have a lot of really world-class scientists. We have some world-class facilities. We have unique facilities. We have a lot of different assets that the federal government can bring to bear on this. And so how do we let people know what we have, and how do we connect businesses to our facilities and to our researchers and their scientists? Yep, that thing backed up. SBIR also plays an important role in this, and although we don't necessarily have a lead role within the FLC for something like SBIR, we do in fact coordinate with the Small Business Administration in the SBIR program, and so many of the small businesses that are interested in our SBIR programs are also interested in our tech transfer programs, and so we want to recognize this link and work together with the Small Business Innovation Research programs assets and make sure that we're connecting the dots here. And then finally, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're evaluating impact. So it's one thing to do things, it's another thing to collect information and reevaluate and sort of close that loop and learn from our past and hopefully do better in the future. So let's zoom in on some of these different points of the action plan. Human capital. Well, we all know we have some certain conflict of interest rules within the federal government that are a little different for private industry, and they cause us some problems. So one of those things is we've contacted the Office of Government Ethics, OGE, and we've asked them to clarify a few things for us. And so it's sort of been an interesting activity where we're asking them, first of all, to look at the idea of prior IP. So we want to make sure we have the best and the brightest scientists when we take at our laboratories. We want to make sure we're hiring people. But if you work with a university and then we try to move you over to a federal laboratory, you might have intellectual property from the work that you've done. In fact, that might be why we're interested in hiring you into a federal laboratory, is to continue in work in that field because you're an expert in that field. But we have conflicts of interest rules that hamper our ability to do that with our scientists. And so that's one of those areas we're asking for OGE to. Now there is a waiver process, but we're asking OGE to actually clarify what are the conditions that we need to consider in order to apply for and grant a waiver so that we can hire the best and the brightest scientists and have them continue to work in this field so that we can take advantage of their work. Now, the big conflict of interest comes, and if they continue to work in the field, is that going to provide more economic value to their prior intellectual property? So that creates a problem. So that's one area we've asked OGE to look at. The other one really kind of is sort of the other end of the scale. So there's the entry into the federal workforce, and then there's the part where you leave the federal workforce. So if you look at the presidential memorandum and you look at this Lab to Market initiative, it's all encouraging entrepreneurship. So that's great, except that if you want to become an entrepreneur and leave a federal laboratory to do it, you've got conflict of interest rules once again. And so in order to, as soon as you start to sort of come up with this concept to create, I really like this invention. I think I can make a go at it. I have a business idea. At what point do you really have to say that's a conflict of interest with your government duties? Things like entrepreneurial leave come up as one of those activities that we are poorly defined. As one of my colleagues likes to say, our entrepreneurial leave policy is, if you want to be an entrepreneur, leave. That's not exactly encouraging lab to market activities. And so we want to make sure that we do that. We want to make sure we're looking at our ethics policies and asking for guidance from the Office of Government Ethics that leads this across all federal agencies to let us know how do we use our rules in a way that sort of protects our employees and protects their interests, and at the same time gives us this flexibility in order to expand our lab to market activities.
Paul, I have a question. So related to entrepreneurial leave, there's some concern that often gets raised in that you end up having a bit of a brain drain by allowing that to happen. Can you speak to perhaps any experiences out there at universities or perhaps even at GOCOs where they have an entrepreneurial leave program, and what do they think about that?
Well, I can only talk anecdotally because I know we don't in my agency, but from what I understand from the agencies that do, is that it's one of those things that really sounds good, but from my understanding, most people don't take advantage of it, and I think there's actually a couple reasons for that. One of them is the people in our laboratories, let's face it, scientists and engineers are not always the best business people. And often the reason that they're at the laboratory, I mean, they've worked very hard to do their PhD. They're, experts in their field. They publish and they understand, they really like doing their work at the laboratories. In fact, if you look at the turnover rate in the federal government, our laboratories are actually some of the people that turn over the least across all federal, job opportunities. So that's where we tend not to lose people. So this whole idea of saying, if in fact we had an entrepreneurial leave policy, we're going to have this giant brain drain is probably a bit unrealistic. But at the same time, you do have some people that are interested and really could launch a business, and so you got to play both sides of that. And unfortunately, right now, we don't really have a way to gauge that very effectively. It causes some of its own problems. Is if you do have an entrepreneurial leave, how do you reintegrate that person? Maybe a little bit less of a problem in a scientific field than it is in somewhat of the the management kind of area. If you're managing the agency versus if you're doing experimental research. But it's one of those things we want to look at, and that we haven't measured well enough. And so that's going to inform future decision making. We're actually trying to take a step back and look at people who have done things successfully as a pilot, and see how we can sort of broaden that experience out to the rest of the federal government.
Yeah, I think you're correct in that our experiences in the federal laboratory obviously can't answer that question. But I do remember having some conversations with some of our GOCO federal labs who have an entrepreneurial lead program, asking that kind of question about the brain drain, and they said actually they have found it to be the opposite. It's actually a great recruiting tool for bringing in the brightest and the best, because they're very interested in making sure that what they develop in the federal labs does come to fruition for the good of the public. So just a little tidbit I learned along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's just it. We want to continue learning. We haven't done enough to really to step back and evaluate these processes, and that's really what we want to try to do under this cross-agency priority goal. So, kind of a really exciting area to me. I mean, when I look across a lot of this cross-agency priority goal, this idea of these new regulations under 15 U.S. Code 3712, well, that sounds sort of cryptic, but that actually, to me, is probably one of those areas that we can make the most headway under this entire activity, in terms of things we haven't necessarily done yet. I'll talk about a few things we have done. But this is new, and I think this is one of those areas where we need a lot of input. And we've started to do some outreach effort, but if you read this little piece of law here in the code, it actually gives authority to develop personnel exchanges. So we actually have authority under the law to create programs. We've just never taken advantage of it. And so one of the things we want to do is step back and look at perhaps creating some regulations that define personnel exchange programs. And like I said, if you read this little piece of code, the U.S. Code, it's actually, maybe 2-3 sentences long. You could probably cover the whole thing up with your thumb in print because it's very short, but it's also very broad authority. And so what we want to really do is we reached out. I've already started talking a little bit to universities, and I've talked a little bit about, I've certainly talked about it in the federal laboratory context, both in some of the FLC executive board as well as with the interagency work group about we need new ideas. We're looking for what is that sort of dream state of personnel exchange, and what would it look like if we can kind of write our own rules on doing personnel exchanges. We have CRADA authority. We can do quite a bit under CRADA authority now, so we don't necessarily need to use something there. But what are those other things? We also have things like interagency personnel agreements. So we have some existing authorities, but what are those other things? What are those roadblocks that we hit where we really think we can, get an advantage? How do we turn on this whole lab-to-market activity if we can exchange people more easily between federal laboratories and businesses? And that's really this whole idea of this new regulations. It sounds always bad. Regulating typically is taking some authority away. You're restricting an activity. But the way this thing is written, it basically says that we can develop programs, and we should put in the regulation what those programs are going to be. And so I think we actually have some pretty broad authority to go out with the rulemaking that develops activities that don't exist today. And this is one of those areas we need input. And so if you're listening on this and you've got great ideas, by all means, let us know. Because that's what we're starting to do is do a lot more outreach to try to get ideas of how we would implement this regulation and what would we write in. Really key area. So the other really key area here is expanding I-Corps program. Well, it's not just I-Corps, in fact. It's all of these training programs for entrepreneurs. I-Corps is a really great example, and it's been a very effective program in basically teaching people how to form, putting together teams, putting them through sort of a training process to be entrepreneurs. Kind of goes back to that whole idea of entrepreneurial leave. It's great to have someone say, I want to be an entrepreneur, but it's not necessarily the easiest shift for a scientist. But putting together these teams and making sure we connect it with training to enable the ability to become an entrepreneur is the key here. And that's really what I-Corps focuses on, and that's the whole point of this section of the cross-agency priority goal, is to really expand that entrepreneurial training and expand the relationship we have with our scientists in understanding their role and their capabilities. And our FLC training goes a long way towards doing this. And we've always been on the forefront of training, through sessions like this and all sorts of other training sessions that we do. But I-Corps is an interesting tool, and I think we can really take advantage of that. And we'll see what else grows. I know DOE has already proposed a DOE LabCorps program, sort of paralleling that within their own area. And so, it's one of those things to look out for. And again, if there's ideas, all of this is open to new ideas because it is something that's growing and trying to pick up steam. Now, collaborations. Well, okay, so one of the things, again, I mentioned the idea of making this a priority for senior level folks at our agencies, and that's always been a concern. Is tech transfer is sort of one of those other duties as assigned, or unfunded mandate is often a common thing that you hear. So why does this fall into collaborations? Well, I just ended up fitting in here. But the idea is to raise the prominence of our tech transfer activities. Really, and it's not so much necessarily saying the tech transfer office is the focus of the activity, but it's much more trying to say that our research activities should be, something that at the end of the day connect to a use. How do we focus on the use of our activities? How do we put this in? How do we prioritize the idea of research for a purpose and research that's going to get put into economic value, essentially, at the end, not just something that's a publication? Publications are fine. Publications that get used to create a new product or service is what we want to focus on. So some of the things that we're looking at is actually language that will go into, for example, SES performance plans, prioritizing tech transfer as one of those activities that's a key element for some of our laboratory management, to make sure that they understand and realize that this is something that's their responsibility. How that flows then down into the individual site. When this started off, it was kind of like put it in the science and research, all of our researchers' performance plans, and that's all well and good, but you really have to, it was recognized that you really have to start at the top. So if you make it a priority at the top, hopefully it'll flow down all the way through the organization. And then the other part of that was actually looking at the GoCos, and so if, tech transfer is sort of like, 0.001% of your deliverables in your contract, well then it's going to be prioritized accordingly. And so we're trying to look at language that might basically boost tech transfer within the performance evaluation that's used on GoCo laboratory contracts, and whether or not that's feasible. And of course that's going to be working a lot with the agencies that own those contracts. It's not just going to be dictated, but it is trying to look at how do we make this mission a bigger part of the evaluation process that's going on at our GoCo labs. Or government-owned contractor operated, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym. But we also want to look at effective mechanisms. So it's interesting, a couple of these different things that we're working on are things that the FLC has taken the lead in the area of sort of looking at across our CRADAs, and are there areas of common language? What are the boilerplates? What are those areas that commonly trip up our partners? Anybody that works with CRADAs realizes, we get pushback on the government use language, we get pushback on the FOIA language, but trying to put some of this information up on our website where we've got really very standard language. So we're trying to collect all the different agencies' CRADAs, basically to look across them and see if there's a lot of standard language. No one's right now trying to force, I say right now, but I hopefully think it'll stay that way. No one's trying to force a standard CRADA across agencies because we've already been there, done that. We hear a lot of pushback on that one size doesn't fit all, so we're trying to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that we're looking at if, in fact, 90% of the language is the same thing that's used across every agency, understanding that and using that information is very valuable. And also understanding and using and addressing these common trip points in a interagency way, rather than having each agency constantly explaining why, no, you can't delete that language, we have to have that in there. But having a place that you can look across all agencies and say, look, here's the common language that you can demonstrate why we have to do things the way we're doing, and I think is it sort of one of those things, one of those tools that we can hopefully streamline the negotiation process within CRADAs. We also, gift authority is kind of an interesting thing. So they want to, this is one of those things that's a little bit more outside the box of where the FLC operates, but I know OSTP has some leverage in this area, is how do we accept gifts? How do we accept things from funding? How do you do sort of these associations, different types of activities that basically bring in resources into the federal laboratories? And how do you use those within our research programs? And then, of course, one of the other areas, and I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with this, we work really well with other people. Sometimes we're not so good at working with ourselves. Sometimes it's a lot more difficult to get an agreement with another federal agency than it is to create it with a partner. And then when you start getting into where you get one or two federal, actually multiple federal agencies working with a single partner on a joint CRADA, it gets very complicated very fast. And in fact, it becomes a problem, and that shouldn't be a problem. I mean, really, if you think about it, it should be very easy to work with ourselves across federal agencies, and that's one of those areas that we want to focus on, is how do we break down the barriers that prevent us from prevent us from working with ourselves, how do we quit tripping over our own selves and work better with our customers so we don't get into these sort of arrangements where we have to do separate CRADAs, but maybe we can do one CRADA that's a joint CRADA rather than having to do multiple different relationships. There's a lot of other ideas. I mean, we've got some of these bigger cross-agency priorities, not to sort of harp on that cross-agency priority goal name, but we do have areas that are of national interest. Things like biofuels actually cut across multiple agencies. There's a lot of different health areas that cut across multiple agencies. But some of these big topics cut across the interests of multiple agencies. And we have a lot of inventions that actually fill in this ecosystem that actually, maybe it's not valuable as one piece of IP, but if you put together several pieces of IP, and often from different agencies, maybe you have a more valuable resource. And so we want to look at ways that we can join up these different pieces of the puzzle and make a better and more attractive picture to our partners by working across agencies on jointly funded projects. Or at least in jointly. Sure.
The question is, how do you envision actually even beginning when you think you have a joint project? How do you know you have a joint project with another agency, for example?
Well, so that's a good question in a lot of ways. So, I mean, one of the biggest things that comes up right now is, honestly, sometimes right now the partner will ask to partner with multiple agencies because they figured it out. Sometimes we're terrible at figuring it out internally, which is really unfortunate. It's one of those areas I think we need to look at what our tools are, because we actually do not have a lot of good mechanisms. The FLC focuses on, we actually produce some showcase events throughout the year. I find it fascinating when we do a showcase on a specific technical area and we bring in researchers from multiple agencies, and it's kind of like you meet you. Did you know you're working in similar areas, or at least in complementary or areas of synergy? And they didn't even know the other person existed. So that's one of those areas that the FLC actually serves as a nice bridge. But at the same time, we do not have a tool or a mechanism right now in order to accomplish that. And it's one of those things I think we need to build. And it's one of those things I think we need a lot of input from agencies. But so we have the Economy Act. We can fund things across agencies. And there is nothing that prohibits us from doing joint CRADAs, but we seem to not be able to do it very effectively. So I don't have a really great answer to it. But we're certainly open to input. Okay, another big area. So right now, if you're out there and you're in a small business and you do a joint, let's say you have a CRADA with the federal government and you develop some new IP and you want to take the lead in patenting that IP. The unfortunate truth is that we poison our partners by giving them large entity status. The U.S. government is, in fact, a large entity. So if you're a small business, you would have otherwise had small entity status. We kind of ruined that for you. It now costs you a lot more money to get your patent. And that's a problem. And so we've identified this problem to the PTO. Actually, when they came out with their rulemaking on microentity status, we actually submitted a proposal to them to look at several different areas. One of them was this idea of not poisoning our partners, such that if you work with the federal government and you actually would otherwise have, or if you're a university, this actually comes up with a lot of joint university projects too. And universities generally have small entity status. They work with us, they lose that technically. And I don't even know if they all even realize that when they do their filings. But we want to work with PTO to change the rules so that at least they can retain their microentity or small entity status so that we don't actually, burden them by working with us. Think about a barrier to collaboration, become a burden to somebody. The other thing, actually if we could get small entity or microentity status for federal labs, that would be even better for us. We'll see what ends up happening on this. I know we've had several discussions with PTO about this. Like I said, we flagged this as one of those issues that came up after the American Invents Act came out, and they were actually looking at different rulemakings. We put this issue on the table. They did look at it. They felt they needed a little bit more authority, and so. But it is one of those areas that that's on the table within this lab to market cross-agency priority goal to basically, it's a milestone for USPTO to look at this and to make sure that they're addressing it, and we'll see how it turns out in the end. I'm not exactly sure what where the end result of that is going to be, but I don't think it'll certainly make it any worse than it is. With any luck, we'll get something substantially better. But at least we've made PTO is very much aware of this problem and is in fact addressing it, and of course they have to report on it as a milestone under this cross-agency priority goal, which again drives action. So hopefully that'll move along pretty expeditiously. Again, so the other area, of course, is co-funding. Like I said, we trip all over ourselves in working with each other sometimes in collaboration. We do even worse sometimes when we try to co-fund things. This is particularly comes up often when we try to co-fund a grant or a contract. That breaks down quickly. We can transfer money between agencies, but when we actually try to, and so that one agency takes the lead, but actually trying to say that we're going to co-fund something and do it together, it breaks down real quick. And that's one of those areas we just need to look at and see how we can do things better. Rather than just, like I said, transferring the money, sometimes agencies are more reluctant to do that rather than maybe sharing. And it seems like one of those more basic things that you should be able to share, but amazingly enough, we can't seem to do that very effectively. Again, this idea of charitable gifts comes into that, so if we get a gift, how do you then share it within both the agency and across agencies, maybe to advance what we're doing in a particular research area. So opening R&D assets, if you stay tuned for one of our later sessions, you will see the FLC's newly launched FLC business tool actually on the second bullet. But the FLC has actually been a pioneer in this over the last several years. We do have an available technology search tool. So under the presidential memorandum, it basically said we need a one-stop shop. All these different agencies have put their information online and said, come see what IT or IP is available. You can come get a license. If you're a small business partner and you have to go through, at least 11 different agencies and hundreds of different laboratories to see what they have available, that can be quite a burden. So the President wanted us to do a one-stop shop. The FLC, in fact, stepped up and provided that service. And so if you go, and like I said, there will be presentations on this later. There is an available technologies tool. We're looking for ways to improve it. We'd love to improve it. We'd love to make it more useful and make it better. And we're working very diligently to do that. We're also looking at, one of the considerations is how do we better utilize the PTO's database? Because, of course, you can search that, but it's not always clear in that what's assigned to the federal government or what, in fact, is a federal invention. That gets a little bit trickier to search. And so how do we better utilize all these different things has come up as one of these sort of consistent themes at in the lab to market cross-agency priority goal. As I said, FLC Business, our new tool, very proud of this tool. It goes out. It's one of these ways that you can find new partners and facilities that actually can meet your needs. So if you go to flcbusiness.com, you will see this tool. It is in fact a database, not a search tool. Like the available technology searches across websites, it's essentially a web crawl or custom Google search. FLC Business is in fact a database. It's as good as the data that we put in, but it does have information on sort of the mission and the purpose of the different laboratories. And so if you think about the fact that, maybe I want to partner with the federal laboratory, who's doing that work? Well, you can use the FLC Business tool to figure that out. We're pulling down information that agencies are putting up under the Open Data Initiative, up on data.gov on what facilities are available and the rules for use. We're pulling that into FLC Business. We're pulling everything we can into the FLC business. In fact, we're pulling the available technologies tool into FLC business. And the idea is to try to make a portal so that we're being business friendly. We want a portal where people can go, figure out what we do, what partnership opportunities are out there, what IP is available, what funding sources are available, trying to pull it all into one place. And as I said, sort of the sister part of economic development to Lab to Market is open data. It's a matter of putting up data sets on data.gov, but the data sets that are going up include making sure that our IP data sets are up on data.gov, as well as any information that we have on facilities. Well, why would we do that? It's kind of an interesting concept. If you were to go to data.gov, it's probably not the most useful data to anybody. It is going to be machine-readable data that's available for you to use. So that's great. I'm not quite sure if you're going to go ahead and shop it. So we do need our user interface, and that's where FLC Business and Available Technologies become a user interface for data. These data sets are actually up because we want to try to give it to third parties. So if somebody, you name it, there's dozens of companies out there that want our IP and they want to represent our IP, and that's great. And we want to make sure that they have a usable data set where they can pick up the information and use it. It's not like we want to keep it all to ourselves and force everybody to come to our database. We actually want to push all this information up for everybody to use. Everybody, anybody, come and use our information. We'd love to get it out there because our goal is to try to connect with partners, not necessarily to get people to come to the FLC website. Again, under the presidential memorandum, there was quite a few different activities that we're looking at. How do we better license our IP? You had things come out of DOE. There was the Next Energy Innovator IP licensing program. I know NIH had several new licensing programs that came out. NIST itself came out with several new licensing programs. The idea here is to pilot new ideas of how do we better attract startups and small businesses in particular into licensing our federal technologies, and how do we basically really grow these programs. So, new ideas and communicating those so other people can use these ideas and implement the programs is part of this goal in opening up the assets. Better outreach for the IP. And then, of course, we kind of get into then this whole other realm, which is much bigger than the FLC itself, which is extramural R&D. Right now we fund, like I said, $130, $140 billion a year in R&D, like I said earlier. Well, most of that, about 2/3 of that, actually goes out to extramural partners. It gets done at universities primarily. It's work that we fund. We have a government use license to use that work. But frankly, I don't even know that the federal laboratories even know what information they have available to use. The information gets reported into iEdison that's run by NIH, and that's great. It's just that a lot of it's proprietary information, and so there's not a quick, easy way to figure out what IP is available or what we have ownership of. And so how do we use extramural R&D across our agencies, and also then how do we promote the extramural R&D? We built it. We paid for it. Somebody in a university used federal dollars to create intellectual property, and we transfer, and under Bayh-Dole, they have the rights to this stuff. But how do we take advantage of that within our federal enterprise? And I know this is a mission area for our laboratories and for our agencies, but it's one of those areas that we need to consider in Lab to Market to make sure that we're not just focusing on our federal laboratories, but we're focusing on all of our investments in R&D. And how do we take advantage of this entire $130 billion a year outlay of dollars that we have from the taxpayer to make sure that these products are available in the U.S. economy? So we aren't going to leave out the universities. It is one of those areas that, we want to start, the approach to this basically is to ask the universities and to ask the extramural partners, what do they think first? We don't want to do anything, it's not government knows best, we're going to tell you how to do this. The same way we want to engage you, and I've brought up several times in this, what are your opinions on this? Please give us ideas. Same kind of idea holds true with the extramural R&D. We want to make sure that we're asking the question first and that we're good listeners rather than being just good talkers. I mentioned SBIR. We are going to work with the SBIR program. SBIR and SBA are actually, so there's a whole SBA work group on that deals with SBIR, and in fact they have the lead for all these different areas. They are launching some new tools. They do have a search tool to look across all SBIR and STTR solicitations, so it's pretty awesome. If you are interested in SBIR, you can go to one site, get links to all, and know when each of the solicitations are opening and closing, and get links to these things, and you can do it in one place. You can search things like FedBizOps and grants.gov and try to find SBIR, but having it as a one-stop shop is just as useful for SBIR as it has been for the Federal Lab Consortium on the available technologies. They're actually doing a lot of work in looking at the lead time. So how do you shorten the time from proposal to outlay of the cash and trying to get the money to small businesses? One of the things about SBIR is a lot of these businesses are new and they're just getting up, and there's plenty that aren't, they're just small businesses, but there's a lot of new businesses. And so if you write a proposal, and that, the government isn't the fastest thing, as most people know, so it can take a long time. So how do you shorten that time from proposal to launching the company and getting the dollars in their hands in order to get moving is a big deal. And the company may live or die based on that little bit of time frame. That it seems inconsequential to us on the federal side. But it's really sometimes a life and death decision for those companies in whether or not they're going to go forward. So we want to get the dollars in their hands, and we're trying to streamline that process for SBIR. Also trying to look at interagency practices. Again, constant theme throughout this, how do we better learn from each other? And things that are successful in one place, how do we transport that to another laboratory or agency?
Paul, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Kind of plays into what you're talking about here. Has there been any consideration given to creating a small business portal that would provide access not only to federal technologies, to SBIR, to SBAA information, other resources, so it's all one portal for all federal resources for a startup, for example?
Yeah, in many ways that was the idea behind FLC Business, is to do a one-stop portal for business needs. And in fact, any ideas of things that we can build into that, I think that's one of those areas where we, the FLC, want to take a lead in using our FLC Business tool to provide that information. And the more we can provide and the more comprehensive we can be, in a usable manner, just putting clutter on the website isn't going to help. But the more we can make it usable by small business and attract them to the site, the better. It'll be more useful, it'll be better information and more comprehensive information, and I think we'll do a lot better job of outreach to those people that might be interested.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we want to reduce lead times for SBIR. That's a key component in making sure we get the money out to the businesses that need them. We also want to do some work in terms of aligning cross-agency R&D priorities. So as I mentioned, we want to try to do some of these collaborations across agencies for some major priority areas. One of the things they're looking at in the SBIR side is trying to say, how do we, sort of a great case in point of how we do joint solicitations is we're not able really to do it, we haven't been able to come up with a joint SBIR solicitation. It's very difficult at times to work on a joint solicitation with agencies. Sometimes we can, sometimes it's very difficult. But at the very least, what is being considered is to at least have multiple agencies put out the same topic, if you will, so that you can propose work across different agencies that all address different parts of that same problem, and so that we address the problem comprehensively across the agencies, kind of from cradle to grave. And if you think about biofuels as a great example, where you might have, the Department of Agriculture developing some sort of a new way to raise crops to use in a fuel. You might have DOD as a major consumer of some of these goods, or as Department of Energy looking at how consumers or providing energy sources, or a lot of different agencies looking at how energy sources are used, to EPA looking at the pollution that comes off of those sources and what are the environmental impacts of these things. I mean, if you look at it, these problems stretch across agencies and across interests. And we want to try to then see if we can use those areas to stretch across things. And SBIR is one of those test cases to see, can we come up with some solicitation topics that cut across agencies and address some of these bigger priority areas across government, rather than focusing simply on one agency's mission. And then, of course, the name of the game in much of this is streamlining. How do you cut the red tape? And so all these reporting, accounting, all these lovely things we like to lay on top of small businesses that deter people from working with the federal government, we want to reduce those barriers and make sure that we're working with business. As I said several times, evaluating impact is a big deal. Right now, all of our metrics in tech transfer, if you look, we produce a federal report on tech transfer that goes to the President and the Congress every year. It's available online. We produce a lot of numbers. How much is our output? You know, you can tell one thing from it. You can tell that we do a lot of work. We do a lot of creatives. We do a lot of licenses. Okay, that's great. That's one side of things. We do anecdotes that sort of talk about success stories, and the FLC is a great example of areas of success stories within our own awards program. But we want to expand that to look at long-term economic impact. So we want to try to collect and utilize basically an academic approach. We want to collect studies on economic impact and sort of use more of an academic approach. So rather than creating a massive database that tags every company that ever deals with us, you want to scare companies away, that's a sure way to do it. We want to basically create a database that allows, or we want to create a database out of impact studies that are done and actually use more of an academic approach and look at peer-reviewed literature and see what is that telling us. Really, you do it in every area in science. You kind of look at what is the literature telling us. Why don't we do that in technology transfer is really kind of an amazing concept that we've never done it before. But that's what we want to do. We've got a lot of studies that are out there. We had a great study that was done, for example, by the Navy. A lot of different agencies do studies on the economic impact of the delivery of our products into the marketplace. And so we want to collect these things and report on that economic impact and see what conclusions we can draw from that rather than creating a massive database of every customer that we've ever touched, because I think that's just a scary thing to do. There are some other type of tools you can use along those lines, and we'll continue to evaluate those. But again, we want to try to minimize some of the impact, some of the the internal impact and the internal cost as well, where we try to collect these pieces of data and then better use those to evaluate our programs and really connect better with our own agencies and our own laboratories. So I am running out of time, and I did say that we would do some Q&A at the end, so we don't have a whole bunch of time for that. But let me, first of all, thank you. Very much appreciate everyone that's been on the line today and has participated in this session, both this as well as throughout our whole session here on this virtual meeting and our Tech to Market activity here with the FLC today. So let me stop and take any other questions that are out there.
Please go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. We have about 3 minutes to answer some of those. So I think one of the burning questions for everyone is, how do we really develop the metrics well? And you sort of touched on that in some of your slides. I'm wondering, Paul, what's been your experience like for NIST in terms of developing some new metrics around new programs that you might be trying to initiate to address the lab to market? Yeah.
Well, it ends up being one of those tough things, and this is one of those other areas that GAO said we need to do a better job on how we evaluate things. We under the presidential memorandum in 2011, we came up with a whole new slate of tech transfer metrics. And the first time you'll see those actually is when we roll out the 2013 results of tech transfer. That sounds like, well, how come you haven't done 2013 yet? First you have to end 2013. Agencies have to tally up their results. They all report them. Now we have to put all the results together. So that report's still going to come out. But we have actually made some big improvements in what we're already doing under the presidential memorandum. Kind of the next step to that is doing this economic impact piece as well. So some of the things we've done is actually, instead of burdening agencies to collect all sorts of new data, what's really fascinating is that NSF already collects tons of data under their science and engineering indicators book that they put out every 2 years. And in fact, the data is at a lower level. And so what we've tried to do is use that data rather than going out and asking the agencies to report a whole bunch, collect and report a whole bunch of information that they've really already collected and reported in NSF. So we're trying to look at the tools that are out there to minimize the burden while maximizing the impact. Not quite sure if that answered your question entirely, but
no, I think that's a very big question to try to answer, and I think a lot of it is dependent on the agency and what types of things they may be implementing. So I'm not seeing any more questions. I would like to just remind the audience, I believe there's going to be sessions tomorrow that relate to FLC business. I believe there's a 9 o'clock session with Mark Snyderman. If you're interested in taking a look at FLC business online, do encourage you to look through the agenda, see what else you might like to join. We have 2 more live sessions later this afternoon. If you're interested in joining those, one will be on valuation, And another one will be on what's your story? How do you write a compelling technology fact sheet with Wendy Kennedy? So with that, I don't see, oh, wait, there is another question. More of such courses that stepwise explain the knowledge of conversion of discoveries and innovations to the commercialization process. I'm a scientist and I feel the portal that would explain and provide knowledge in stepwise ways would be useful. That's more of a comment, I think, for you, Paul, than for a question.
Well, it is, and actually in some respects, Tom, I think you're almost in a better position to answer that as part of the training committee for the FLC. I mean, one of the things the FLC is really looking at, and this goes back a little bit to the I-Core idea, is how do we address training courses for our laboratory scientists and engineers, essentially our researchers, to really provide them some of the tools rather than just focusing on our tech transfer offices. And so we are actually looking at that and hopefully going to develop more tools in order to make that available. We've started putting some of this training online, and I hope we'll do that in the future. I don't know if you want to address that a little bit yourself, Tom.
Yes, so we do have several webinars already that are up on the FLC website. Some of them are actually today. Some of the recordings are today in the session, so continue to look through that. And I think depending on where you are, there's a lot of opportunity to learn how to do the business of science, if you will, through your local economic development groups. I would encourage you, particularly county economic development groups, have a lot of courses set up through your local universities. You can join those as well. But we at FSC are developing some online courses, but also you could join us at a national meeting in Colorado in April, where we will have a full day of training related to technology transfer, and then there's a lot of sessions throughout the meeting over those couple of days in April to help you learn more about this area, particularly as it's related to federal technology. Okay, so with that, we are out of time. I want to thank Paul for his excellent talk, and I know I've learned a little bit more about Lab to Market. And Paul, one final thing, and that is, can you guide people to give you feedback or input in terms of not just the session, but the actual federal Lab to Marketplace? I know you guys are always looking for input from the community. Is there a place where they can do that?
Well, I did put up on that last slide. You got my contact information in terms of just an email. But okay. There are people in every agency actually that are working on this, and there's a good point of contact typically for those. So, I mean, one of the things you can easily do is push it up through your agency lead. I will tell you the two goal leads for this are Tom Khalil from OSTP and Ellen Williams over at DOE. So, particularly if you're in DOE, that's probably, you got a very easy channel to work through Ellen.
Great.
But certainly try to push it up, and, by all means, feel free to email me as well.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Paul, for joining us today, and look forward to seeing folks online this afternoon. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.